Just staying in the neurosciences at this point with an extension to law. Adam Kolber is a visiting fellow at Princeton at the moment at the Center for Human Values, which is where Peter Singer is, I believe. And he's actually a law professor at the University of San Diego. So he writes about legal and ethical implications of emerging neurotechnologies. And he actually has a neuroethics and law blog, which I recommend to you. This is Adam Kolber.
Great. Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm going to talk today about what Pat Churchland called the application side of neuroethics or neurolaw. And new technologies in general are having a big effect on the law. Just a few days ago, that's our Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Roberts, and he said that technology-related cases could be the most important area of law considered by the Supreme Court over the next quarter of a century. So, and then we have just a few weeks ago, the MacArthur Foundation announced a 3-year, $10 million grant to fund research in neuroscience and law, and that includes actual lab experiments, right? Not just kind of lawyers doing some research in the library. Emerging neuroscience technologies fall into two broad categories. You have your information gathering technologies and your enhancement technologies, and I'm just going to have time to give an example of one of each of these. Now, first I'm going to talk about pain. There are a few phenomena that are more important to the law, to the tort system, to things like disability hearings than the experience of pain. Damages from pain and other kinds of suffering may constitute as much as half of all awards in personal injury cases. And then, of course, you've got doctors who are interested in measuring pain. They need to know, do I give this patient narcotics? If so, how much do I give? So how do we know if someone's in pain? Let's take a look. This guy clearly has some back pain. We know that because he has his hand on his back. This guy is really in pain, and we know that because he has this red aura illuminating the area. This guy, agony. He has lightning bolts coming out of his back. Right? See, of course, it's very easy to feign pain because we don't have a lot of good physical evidence. Often there's nothing observable to really show us that this person has pain. Sometimes there'll be diagnostic images that seem like the person should be in pain, but in fact they're not in pain. So why is it so difficult to measure? Well, pain is private, right, in a descriptive sense. We have uniquely direct access to our own pain. When it comes to other people, it's tough, right? We have to rely on what they tell us. We have to rely on their pain behaviors, right? Even if you and I yell and scream the same amount, it doesn't mean that we're experiencing necessarily quite the same amount of pain. Doctors will ask people to rate their pain on a scale of 1 to 10, where 10 is the most pain you can imagine. Well, what I put as 7 may not be your number 7. I may have a much more vivid imagination about pain than you do, and so I rate my pains lower. It's supposed to be checking your pain, not your imagination. There are self-report problems. People seem to tolerate pain longer when they're queried by an experimenter of the opposite sex than of the same sex. Pain is multifaceted. It has sensory components, affective components, emotional components. There are incentives to lie, right, especially in the tort system and in the kind of administrative hearings I mentioned. We don't have really good data on malingering, right? How often do people just fake this? But look, even if the rates are low, given that, I mean, there are just billions and billions of dollars moving around in the tort system, if even a small percentage of these involve malingered claims or grossly exaggerated claims, we're talking about, you know, a lot of money here that's either going to people who don't deserve it or, importantly, failing to go to people who actually deserve that compensation under the law as it is. So, Enlightenment 2.0 alarm going on here, right? Billions of dollars are changing hands in this way using a technology that's existed for hundreds of years, you know, the court system, but we don't really know how good that technology is. We also have juries that are trying to attach dollar figures to pain cases. And how do juries do that? Well, if I said hocus pocus, that would be a pretty good first answer. So there's definitely some potential here to broaden our scientific information here and to apply it. And let me just go back for 1 second. You could imagine that there's going to be questions about when is the science good enough. Well, I say that if you're looking for the motivating principle here, we want to say, when is it better than what we have now, right? It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be better than what you currently get in the system now. Okay, so how can we do this more objectively? here's a slide from 2004 study, Journal of Neuroscience, looking at chronic pain using just traditional structural imaging, MRI, and what did they find? They found that between the brains of a group of people with chronic back pain compared to a group of people without it, well, on average, the group with chronic back pain showed reduced gray matter density in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the right thalamus. Okay. Ramachandran just mentioned DTI. Here's a DTI image looking at the diffusion of water molecules in the brain, telling us something about, brain structure non-invasively. And here's what a German team reported in 2006. They said, in chronic pain sufferers, the organization of cerebral microstructure is much more complex and active in the areas of the brain involved in pain processing, emotion, and the stress response. Okay, here's a big if. If it turns out that chronic pain is correlated with brain structures that are absent in malingerers, we may someday have a new method of supporting or challenging claims of malingered pain. So far I've been speaking about chronic pain. Researchers have also studied acute pain using fMRI, and under fMRI, certain regions of the brain's cortex show greater activation in subjects when they're experiencing pain, and there also seems to be an intensity feature. In other words, the amount of activation increases with the intensity of the pain stimulus, suggesting we might get some insight. Again, it's harder to know amounts of pain than just this kind of, are they malingering, but perhaps some insight. So here's one experiment to look at. Basically, researchers exposed subjects to a heat stimulus, and they asked them to rate it 1 to 10. So we were getting some self-reports, big range. The same heat stimulus, 49 degrees Celsius, some people put it at 9 out of 10. That was the most. One person put it at 1 out of 10. And what they did was they separated the group into these low, medium, and high intensity groups based on their self-reports. Then they looked at the groups, looked at the people under fMRI, compared the low sensitivity people to the high sensitivity people. And the high sensitivity group showed greater activation under fMRI than the low sensitivity group in these areas associated with pain. Okay, now I'm sure there are neuroscientists in the room already saying lots of the caveats, and there's lots, and I'm just going to mention a few. One is that most of the research is looking at groups of brains under one condition compared to groups of pain on another condition, and that's not good enough for the courtroom or the clinic. So much more will have to be done there. Brains vary considerably from person to person. It's not clear how uniform are the brain structures associated with pain. Different kinds of pain are going to have different kinds of effects. The less uniform are these kinds of responses, the more difficult it's going to be to compare one person's pain to another. Another problem, countermeasures, right? Can people do things while under the magnet to kind of screw up the results? Probably more a problem for functional imaging than structural imaging. Pretty hard to change something structural about your brain. So that has some interesting promise, at least as far as the countermeasures are concerned. And it's not as though brain imaging is the only thing that might give us some data. There's work in galvanic skin response, and even your heart rate's going to change with pulse. So part of this is sort of like, what's all of science going to tell us about pain and about this kind of distress? A point about causation. Well, first, when it comes to these kinds of chronic back pain, I'm not making a claim about causation. I'm not saying the pain causes the changes in the structures. Maybe there's a predisposition associated with the structures of the brain. But the claim is at least that there might be some correlation, and that might give us enough to know if a person is genuinely experiencing pain. There's another element to the causation, another kind of causation it doesn't tell us, and that's something that lawyers worry about, namely, the person says, I have chronic back pain because I had a slip and fall injury in your grocery store. Well, even if they have chronic back pain, it doesn't mean that it came from falling in your grocery store. They might have had it for some totally different reason. It's obviously not going to help with that problem either. Finally, privacy. Well, neuroscientists are working on efforts at seeing the neural correlates of all different kinds of subjective experiences, not just pain. So they're trying to find out things about racial bias or gender bias or sexual orientation. Not clearly experiences, but experience-related. And those kinds of things seem more likely to raise privacy concerns than something like pain. Pain seems like something we're pretty familiar with in the medical system. There might be medical privacy interests, but it just doesn't seem to be a kind of, oh, I'm worried that you're reading my mind kind of problem, at least not very much. Nevertheless, as we get better at penetrating the privacy of our experiences in this descriptive sense, the more we're going to have to worry about issues of privacy in the normative sense. So I think that largely wraps up this part one that's about information gathering technologies. Moving on to part two, enhancement. Okay, so you're probably familiar with these kinds of enhancement issues in athletics, right? The use of things like steroids to make you not just healthy, not just normal, but to make you better than well. And of course, the same issue is coming up now with new neurotechnologies and pharmaceuticals to maybe give you better concentration or better memory, et cetera, et cetera. This distinction between therapy and enhancement, it's not a very clear one, but you get the rough idea associated with it. Now, not only might you want to make your memory better, let's say, you might also want to be able to dampen your memory or to erase a memory. Why? Well, sometimes it's very hard to do this. If you've had a kind of traumatic experience and you're haunted by a memory, you want the power, the ability to get rid of it, but you can't always do it. And this comes up sometimes in, say, the PTSD context. Okay, now this sort of memory erasure, that's still very much science fiction, but there is some evidence that we may be able to pharmaceutically dampen the emotional intensity of memories of a recent traumatic event. And some experiments suggest that a drug called propranolol, it's already approved by the FDA to treat hypertension, that it may be able to dull the emotional pain associated with the memory of a traumatic experience as long as you take it within a few hours after it. There are lots of drugs that will impair your memory once you start taking your drug, but it's harder to find a relatively safe way to dampen memories of events from the recent past, and that's kind of important if you're trying to deal with things like trauma. So there is some ongoing pilot. There was a pilot study about propranolol and treatment of PTSD, showed some promise. More studies are underway. I don't know whether or not it's going to turn out to work. I also don't know whether or not propranolol is going to affect your episodic memory, whether it's going to affect your memory for factual events. But here's a real-life version of some of the issues that are raised by drugs that enable you to intentionally alter your memories. And this just came out, this was just discussed in a Time magazine article. A woman goes to her doctor for a biopsy. She says she'd prefer to have local anesthesia. She doesn't want to have general anesthesia unless it's really necessary. So there's a biopsy, and they send it to a pathologist in the hospital just to take a quick look at the sample. And he's in another room, and he comes onto the intercom where this woman is, and he starts saying, "This looks terrible." Now, the the pathologist who's in another room comes on the intercom, doesn't realize that the patient can hear him, thinks that this is a normal case where the patient is out. So he starts saying these things like, oh, it looks terrible, and it's a really bad kind of cancer most likely, et cetera, et cetera. And the woman could hear it because she wasn't out, and she starts getting really upset. Oh, my children, and what does this mean? And she's very worked up about it, all very understandable. And so what happens next is very interesting. The anesthesiologist who's in the room injects her with a drug that he had ready, a run-of-the-mill drug called propofol, pretty standard kind of anesthetic, and the drug puts her out. But it also erases, and I think it's pretty fair to say erasure, it's pretty close to a kind of erasure, her memory of just the last few minutes, a well-understood effect of the drug. And so when she comes out, she doesn't remember hearing this preliminary biopsy result. Okay, now, as a law professor, this is like, wow, lots of interesting things going on. This is what I call a great exam question, right? Did the injection of the drug make things better, or did it make things worse? All kinds of questions about, could this have been a negligent infliction of emotional distress by the part of the pathologist? Seems kind of unlikely, but definitely certain issues about violations of informed consent by injecting the drug. And so our damage is now higher because of that, because it was some sort of battery or some sort of lack of informed consent, or are they lower? Lots of, I think, really interesting questions. And so I'll broaden the discussion a little bit. Memory is important to the law for these two kinds of different reasons. There's the fact-finding end, things like depositions, right, or witness testimony, or all kinds of trial testimony. And so that's one aspect, but there's this other aspect, and that's the affective component of memory. That's things like emotional distress damages and that sort of thing. And there's a whole bunch of legal issues on both sides. So with fact-finding, we're worrying about things like witness reliability. Importantly, we're worried about some of these issues even before we know whether the technology works. Why? Well, you have Roger Pittman in Mass General Hospital who is testing propranolol, right? And so people come in with traumatic experience to the ER. Some of them may get propranolol to see if it eases the intensity of the memory, the emotional intensity of the memory. So if you're a lawyer and you're involved in some litigation that happened beforehand, and this person's going to testify, whether or not propranolol or whatever other drug you're testing, whether or not it works, it starts to raise a legal question about whether we're going to admit testimony about it and what sort of testimony to admit. Okay, other issues, obstruction of justice, right? So the traditional case is you open up the filing cabinet, you take some information out, you tear it up before, so it's not used in some upcoming judicial proceeding. Well, maybe the same thing when you intentionally dampen or erase a memory. So that's sort of like, think about the anesthesiologist in this case. The anesthesiologist, on the one hand, may have eased the memory of the patient, may have eased the suffering. At the same time, he may have also eliminated the evidence against him were there some sort of tort or criminal charge made against him. And you can imagine the same thing if you're making your own decision about whether to use a drug like this, right? There'd be questions about easing your own suffering, whereas you might not be able to give information that's valuable to society, right, in case you need to help find a perpetrator or prosecute somebody in court. So interesting questions there. Spoliation of evidence is just sort of like the civil equivalent of obstruction of justice, and of course lots of evidentiary issues about what kinds of things can come in to court. Affective side. Okay, so questions about malpractice. When might it be malpractice to dampen a memory? And this, I think, is really interesting. How do we calculate the damages from dampening a memory or erasing a memory that should have been left alone? Questions about what employers can do. Can they make employees take drugs like this? Mitigation of emotional distress damages. Suppose you're a plaintiff who suffers from some set of traumatic memories. Somebody's injured you, you're hurt, you have traumatic memories associated with it, and you want to get a recovery from it, but let's say you don't want to take these kinds of memory dampening drugs, right? Maybe you have some right to be free of drugs that tamper with your memory. Well, now the defendant's going to say, I shouldn't have to pay you the full amount. You could have mitigated your damages. You could have taken a drug like this. Interesting question there. And of course, lots of constitutional questions. You can find Supreme Court cases that talk about things like a freedom of mind, but they're really not applied to anything quite like this. So it's really hard to know how courts would come out in deciding whether you have certain constitutional rights associated with tampering with your own memory. Okay, so President's Council on Bioethics. Group of neuroscientists, clergy, lawyers, law professors, doctors, designed to advise the president, and they come out with a report in 2003 about enhancement generally. And some of the council members, and they do speak more specifically about memory dampening, some council members were open-minded about enhancement technologies, others were much more skeptical. So, what does the council think of memory dampening? It's very concerned that it's unnatural, that it may dehumanize us in various ways. Council doesn't make any particular recommendations, but the content and the tone of the report indicate that the council has at least some pretty serious reservations about the technology. Like what? That's going to prevent us from truly coming to terms with trauma. It's going to tamper with our identities. It's going to demean the genuineness of human life. It's going to lead us to forget memories we're obligated to keep, inure us to the pain of others, etc., etc. Okay? So here comes this kind of Enlightenment 2.0 alarm, and here's what it means. Well, I don't have time to discuss each of these concerns in general, but at least some of them have a bias toward our natural psychological makeup, as a concern for using these kinds of enhancement drugs. And that's okay to some extent. It's fine to say, as for medical reasons or scientific reasons, it's going to be hard to beat what we've gotten from, hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. That's fine. But what you can see from reading the report is that there's a group of council members that are concerned with violating what's natural just because it's natural. In other words, even if they believe we could genuinely enhance these kinds of cognitive abilities, they would still hesitate to do it by focusing on concerns about the giftedness of life and about what our given human nature is. And so some people have been concerned, at least, that there's a kind of quasi-religious tone to this aspect of the report. And so there's concerns about it, and I'll mention this. Here's a cartoon that sort of responds, right? Our memory naturally decays and has all of its own natural processes of altering. She says, honey refines her memory. In some small way, I'd miss you, honey. Well, in some way, I'd miss you, honey. You complete me. Okay? So we naturally go through this process, but yet when it happens naturally, the council isn't particularly concerned about it. My view is there are reasons to restrict a memory dampening technology under certain kinds of conditions, but we can do this in a rather focused kind of way. Maybe we need to expand obstruction laws. Maybe we need to give doctors certain obligations to make inquiries before they give them to patients. All right, so the last point here is about what I call our freedom of memory. Well, there's all kinds of new technologies out there, technologies to dampen memories. People are working on efforts to enhance memory, and we may have rights to be free of forced dampening, forced enhancement. You may be familiar with efforts to use neuroimaging as a method of memory detection, right? The fantasy being something like, hold up the image of the terrorist and say, do you recognize this person? And before they even answer you, we're checking in the MRI, are they accessing areas of the brain associated with memory? Well, it's a long way off, but at least the notion is there that we might have certain interests in memory privacy. Elizabeth Loftus was here last year, and she spoke about the possibility of implanting a false memory, so I'll just mention that too. Lots of these things can't happen yet, but it's sort of interesting to imagine what would this bundle of rights be like. Before these new technologies came out, it didn't even make sense to have this discussion. We couldn't even really imagine it just beyond pure science fiction. Now we've moved it up at least a little bit. So I'm going to suggest that we might have some rights related to our freedom of memory. Each of these different technologies implicates somewhat different concerns, but the kind of central issues about memory, these questions about your rights to your own memory, to your own mind, versus society's interest in your memory and in mind, are going to come up quite a bit. I thank you very much for your time.
So, one question only. Lee Silver at the back there. Oh, all right, David Alberts is back as well, just very, very quickly. Okay.
Adam, we had this discussion a couple of weeks ago at Princeton.
In that case.
But the question is, you don't distinguish between individuals who want to alter their own memories versus people who want to take control of somebody else's body. And I think that's a really critical discussion. And as you know, half the members of the President's Bioethics Council don't believe that we actually own our own bodies. Our bodies are owned by God. So you can see where they're coming from. And I wonder whether you distinguish, whether you think that individuals, competent individuals, should have the right to do what they want, or you do think that society should be telling individuals not to mess with their own memories.
Right, so I absolutely think there's an important distinction there, and that fundamentally you should have quite a bit more control over your own brain than the government should have over it. There will be these difficult questions, right, when it comes to a person who's a victim of, say, a sexual assault. We have this interest in healing that person and this interest in preventing this from happening again. So I don't know that I have the calculation or the solution to know, how much should the government be able to do, how much should the individual be able to do, but I absolutely agree that there's a fundamental difference between those two issues.
Okay, so thank you very much. Great. Let's move on. No, he went afterwards.
Okay.
Oh, you can. Go ahead. I didn't know you had a mic. Go ahead. Fine.
If we don't have time, it's a quick question. There was just one thing I was puzzled about. In the first section of the talk, on the question of trying to compare degrees of people's pain. Mm-hmm. Now, there were several other concerns there. There were concerns about eliminating lying, stuff like that. Let's put those aside for the moment. Just on the question of comparing degrees of real pain, there's a puzzle about how this kind of technology could get us beyond what we're getting from their testimony, because all we're doing in order to correlate our understanding of the brain is depending on their testimony, comparing their testimony with their neural excitations.
Okay, so the answer is you have to start with what you take to be your best evidence of a person's condition. And that may be, you know, their crying behavior, it may be their self-reports. I don't know what you're going to take that evidence to be, but once you've got that, you try to find correlations with brain imaging. And you said, well, let's put aside the lying part, but actually that's almost entirely what I'm most interested in.
I see.
Because that takes care of the problem. But I absolutely agree, once you get rid of that, it gets really hard to do. So the closest I could say is decide what you take your best evidence to be, try to find inferences, and then use that to deal with people when you're not sure you can trust them.
So tell me if you agree with the following theorem. Put aside the question of lying. The brain imaging isn't going to get us beyond the collection of our best evidence without the brain imaging.
I'm not sure. It might be the case that if you had a really thorough theory of the brain, right, a really thorough theory about how everything worked, maybe then you could.
I see.
But
Good.
absent that, I'm not sure.
Good. Thank you.